Yet could he not his closing eyes withdraw, though less and less of Emily he saw, so, speechless for a little space he lay, then grasped the hand he held, and sighed his soul away. Palamon and a sight. The indisposition of Edith confined her to bed during the eventful day on which she had received such an unexpected shock from the sudden apparition of Morton. Next morning, however, she was reported to be so much better that Lord Evandale resumed his purpose of leaving Ferryno. At a late hour in the forenoon Lady Emily entered the apartment of Edith with a peculiar gravity of manner. Having received and paid the compliments of the day, she observed it would be a sad one for her, though it would relieve Miss Bellenden of an encumbrance. "My brother leaves us today, Miss Bellenden." "Leaves us," exclaimed Edith, in surprise, "for his own house, I trust?" "I have reason to think he meditates a more distant journey," answered Lady Emily. "He has little to detain him in this country." "Good heaven!" exclaimed Edith. "Why was I born to become the wreck of all that is manly and noble? What can be done to stop him from running headlong on ruin? I will come down instantly, say that I implore he will not depart until I speak with him." "It will be in vain, Miss Bellenden, but I will execute your commission," and she left the room as formally as she had entered it, and informed her brother Miss Bellenden was so much recovered as to propose coming downstairs ere he went away. "I suppose," she added pettishly, "the prospect of being speedily released from our company has wrought a cure on her shattered nerves." "Sister," said Lord Evandale, "you are unjust, if not envious." "Unjust I may be, Evandale, but I should not have dreamt," glancing her eye at a mirror, "of being thought envious without better cause. But let us go to the old lady. She is making a feast in the other room which might have dined all your troop when you had one." Lord Evandale accompanied her in silence to the parlor, for he knew it was in vain to contend with her prepossessions and offended pride. They found the table covered with refreshments, arranged under the careful inspection of Lady Margaret. "Ye could hardly will be said to breakfast this morning, my Lord Evandale, and ye maun e'en partake of a small collation before ye ride, such as this poor house, whose inmates are so much indebted to you, can provide in their present circumstances. For my own part, I like to see young folk take some refection before they ride out upon their sports or their affairs, and I said as much to His Most Sacred Majesty when he breakfasted at Tilliatudlem in the year of grace 1651, and His Most Sacred Majesty was pleased to reply, drinking to my health at the same time on a flagon of Rhenish wine, 'Lady Margaret, you speak like a Highland oracle.' These were His Majesty's very words, so that your lordship may judge whether I have not good authority to press young folk to partake of their vivers." It may be well supposed that much of the good lady's speech failed Lord Evandale's ears, which were then employed in listening for the light step of Edith. His absence of mind on this occasion, however natural, cost him very dear. While Lady Margaret was playing the kind hostess, a part she delighted and excelled in, she was interrupted by John Goodale, who, in the natural phrase for announcing an inferior to the mistress of a family, said, "There was ane wanting to speak to her ladyship." "Ane? What ane? Has he nae name? Ye speak as if I kept a shop, and was to come at everybody's whistle." "Yes, he has a name," answered John, "but your ladyship likes ill to hear't." "What is it, you fool?" "It's Calf Gibby, my lady," said John, in a tone rather above the pitch of decorous respect, on which he occasionally trespassed, confiding in his merit as an ancient servant of the family and a faithful follower of their humble fortunes. "It's Calf Gibby, and your ladyship will hate, that keeps Edie Henshaw's kye down yonder at the brig end. That's him that was Guza Gibby at Tilliatudlem, and gie to the Wappenshaw, and that." "Hold your peace, John," said the old lady, rising in dignity. "You are very insolent to think I would speak why a person like that. Let him tell his business to you or Mrs. Hedrig." "He'll no hear o' that, my leddy. He says them that sent him bade him gie the thing to your leddyship's own hand direct, or to Lord Evandale's, he wots na whilk. But, to say the truth, he's far frae fresh, and he's but an idiot and he were." Then turn him out, said Lady Margaret, and tell him to come back tomorrow when he is sober. I suppose he comes to crave some benevolence, as an ancient follower o' the house. Like enough, my Letty, for he's in rags, poor creature. Guttiel made another attempt to get at Gibbie's commission, which was indeed of the last importance, being a few lines from Morton to Lord Evandale, acquainting him with the danger in which he stood from the practices of Oliphant, and exhorting him either to instant flight, or else to come to Glasgow and surrender himself, where he could assure him of protection. This billet, hastily written, he entrusted to Gibbie, whom he saw feeding his herd beside the bridge, and backed with a couple of dollars his desire that it might instantly be delivered into the hand to which it was addressed. But it was decreed that Goose Gibbie's intermediation, whether as an emissary or as a man-at-arms, should be unfortunate to the family of Tilliotidlum. He unluckily tarried so long at the alehouse to prove if his employer's coin was good that, when he appeared at Ferry No, the little sense which nature had given him was effectually drowned in ale and brandy, and instead of asking for Lord Evandale, he demanded to speak with Lady Margaret, whose name was more familiar to his ear. Being refused admittance to her presence, he staggered away with the letter undelivered, perversely faithful to Morton's instructions in the only point in which it would have been well had he departed from them. A few minutes after he was gone, Edith entered the apartment. Lord Evandale and she met with mutual embarrassment, which Lady Margaret, who only knew in general that their union had been postponed by her granddaughter's indisposition, set down to the bashfulness of a bride and bridegroom, and, to place them at ease, began to talk to Lady Emily on indifferent topics. At this moment Edith, with a countenance as pale as death, muttered, rather than whispered, to Lord Evandale a request to speak with him. He offered his arm, and supported her into the small ante-room, which, as we have noticed before, opened from the parlour. He placed her in a chair, and, taking one himself, awaited the opening of the conversation. "I am distressed, my lord," were the first words she was able to articulate, and those with difficulty. "I scarce know what I would say, nor how to speak it." "If I have any share in occasioning your uneasiness," said Lord Evandale, mildly, "you will soon, Edith, be released from it." "You are determined then, my lord," she replied, "to run this desperate course with desperate men, in spite of your own better reason, in spite of your friends' entreaties, in spite of the almost inevitable ruin which yawns before you?" "Forgive me, Miss Bellenden, even your solicitude on my account must not detain me when my honor calls. My horses stand ready saddled, my servants are prepared, the signal for rising will be given so soon as I reach Kilsyth. If it is my fate that calls me, I will not shun meeting it. It will be something," he said, taking her hand, "to die deserving your compassion, since I cannot gain your love." "Oh, my lord, remain," said Edith, in a tone which went to his heart. "Time may explain the strange circumstance which has shocked me so much, my agitated nerves may recover their tranquility. Oh, do not rush on death and ruin. Remain to be our prop and stay, and hope everything from time." "It is too late, Edith," answered Lord Evandale, "and I were most ungenerous could I practice on the warmth and kindliness of your feelings towards me. I know you cannot love me. Nervous distress, so strong as to conjure up the appearance of the dead or absent, indicates a predilection too powerful to give way to friendship and gratitude alone. But were it otherwise, the die is now cast." As he spoke thus, Cutty burst into the room, terror and haste in his countenance. "Oh, my lord, hide yourself! They hae beset the outlets o' the house," was his first exclamation. "They? Who?" said Lord Evandale. "A party of horse, headed by Basil Oliphant," answered Cutty. "Oh, hide yourself, my lord," echoed Edith, in an agony of terror. "I will not, by heaven," answered Lord Evandale. "What right has the villain to assail me or stop my passage? I will make my way, were he backed by a regiment. Tell Halliday and Hunter to get out the horses, and now, farewell, Edith." He clasped her in his arms, and kissed her tenderly, then, bursting from his sister, who, with Lady Margaret, endeavoured to detain him, rushed out and mounted his horse. All was in confusion. The women shrieked and hurried in consternation to the front windows of the house, from which they could see a small party of horsemen, of whom 2 only seemed soldiers. They were on the open ground before Cuddy's cottage, at the bottom of the descent from the house, and showed caution in approaching it, as if uncertain of the strength within. "He may escape, said Edith. "Oh, would he but take the by-road!" But Lord Evandale, determined to face a danger which his high spirit undervalued, commanded his servants to follow him, and rode composedly down the avenue. Old Guttiel ran to arm himself, and Cuddy snatched down a gun which was kept for the protection of the house, and, although on foot, followed Lord Evandale. It was in vain his wife, who had hurried up on the alarm, hung by his skirts, threatening him with death by the sword or halter for meddling with other folks' matters. "Hand your peace, ye be," said Cuddy, "and that's braid Scotch, or I wot no what is. Is it ither folks' matters to see Lord Evandale murdered before my face?" And down the avenue he marched. But considering on the way that he composed the whole infantry, as John Guttiel had not appeared, he took his vantage ground behind the hedge, hammered his flint, cocked his piece, and, taking a long aim at Laird Basil, as he was called, stood prompt for action. As soon as Lord Evandale appeared, Oliphant's party spread themselves a little, as if preparing to enclose him. Their leader stood fast, supported by 3 men, 2 of whom were dragoons, the third in dress and appearance a countryman, all well armed. But the strong figure, stern features, and resolved manner of the third attendant made him seem the most formidable of the party, and whoever had before seen him could have no difficulty in recognizing Balfour of Burleigh. "Follow me," said Lord Evandale to his servants, "and if we are forcibly opposed, do as I do." He advanced at a hand gallop towards Oliphant, and was in the act of demanding why he had thus beset the road, when Oliphant called out, "Shoot the traitor," and the whole 4 fired their carabines upon the unfortunate nobleman. He reeled in his saddle, advanced his hand to the holster, and drew a pistol, but, unable to discharge it, fell from his horse mortally wounded. His servants had presented their carabines. Hunter fired at random, but Halliday, who was an intrepid fellow, took aim at Inglis, and shot him dead on the spot. At the same instant a shot from behind the hedge still more effectually avenged Lord Evandale, for the ball took place in the very midst of Basil Oliphant's forehead, and stretched him lifeless on the ground. His followers, astonished at the execution done in so short a time, seemed rather disposed to stand inactive, when Burleigh, whose blood was up with the contest, exclaimed, "Down with the Midianites," and attacked Halliday sword in hand. At this instant the clatter of horses' hoofs was heard, and a party of horse, rapidly advancing on the road from Glasgow, appeared on the fatal field. They were foreign dragoons, led by the Dutch commandant Wittenbold, accompanied by Morton and his civil magistrate. A hasty call to surrender, in the name of God and King William, was obeyed by all except Burleigh, who turned his horse and attempted to escape. Several soldiers pursued him by command of their officer, but, being well mounted, only the 2 headmost seemed likely to gain on him. He turned deliberately twice, and discharging first one of his pistols, and then the other, rid himself of the one pursuer by mortally wounding him, and of the other by shooting his horse, and then continued his flight to Bothwell Bridge, where, for his misfortune, he found the gates shut and guarded. Turning from thence, he made for a place where the river seemed passable, and plunged into the stream, the bullets from the pistols and carabines of his pursuers whizzing around him. 2 balls took effect when he was past the middle of the stream, and he felt himself dangerously wounded. He reined his horse round in the midst of the river, and returned towards the bank he had left, waving his hand, as if with the purpose of intimating that he surrendered. The troopers ceased firing at him accordingly, and awaited his return, 2 of them riding a little way into the river to seize and disarm him. But it presently appeared that his purpose was revenge, not safety. As he approached the 2 soldiers, he collected his remaining strength, and discharged a blow on the head of one, which tumbled him from his horse. The other dragoon, a strong, muscular man, had in the meanwhile laid hands on him. Burleigh, in requital, grasped his throat, as a dying tiger seizes his prey, and both, losing the saddle in the struggle, came headlong into the river, and were swept down the stream. Their course might be traced by the blood which bubbled up to the surface. They were twice seen to rise, the Dutchman striving to swim, and Burleigh clinging to him in a manner that showed his desire that both should perish. Their corpses were taken out about a quarter of a mile down the river. As Balfour's grasp could not have been unclenched without cutting off his hands, both were thrown into a hasty grave, still marked by a rude stone and a ruder epitaph. Gentle reader, I did request of mine honest friend Peter Proudfoot, travelling merchant, known to many of this land for his faithful and just dealings, as well in muslins and cambrics as in small wares, to procure me on his next peregrinations to that vicinage, a copy of the epitaph Ion alluded to. And, according to his report, which I see no ground to discredit, it runneth thus. Here lies ane saint to prelate surly, being John Balfour, sometime of Burleigh, who stirred up to vengeance take, for solemn league and Seovinant's sake, upon the Magus Moor in Fife, did tack James Sharp the apostate's life, by Dutchman's hands was hacked and shot, then drowned in Clyde near the Somme spot. While the soul of this stern enthusiast flitted to its account, that of the brave and generous Lord Evandale was also released. Morton had flung himself from his horse upon perceiving his situation, to render his dying friend all the aid in his power. He knew him, for he pressed his hand, and, being unable to speak, intimated by signs his wish to be conveyed to the house. This was done with all the care possible, and he was soon surrounded by his lamenting friends. But the clamorous grief of Lady Emily was far exceeded in intensity by the silent agony of Edith. Unconscious even of the presence of Morton, she hung over the dying man, nor was she aware that fate, who was removing one faithful lover, had restored another as if from the grave, until Lord Evandale, taking their hands in his, pressed them both affectionately, united them together, raised his face as if to pray for a blessing on them, and sunk back and expired in the next moment. Conclusion. I had determined to waive the task of a concluding chapter, leaving to the reader's imagination the arrangements which must necessarily take place after Lord Evandale's death. But as I was aware that precedents are wanting for a practice which might be found convenient both to readers and compilers, I confess myself to have been in a considerable dilemma, when fortunately I was honoured with an invitation to drink tea with Miss Martha Buskbody, a young lady who has carried on the profession of mantua making at Gandersclough in the neighbourhood, with great success, for about 40 years. Knowing her taste for narratives of this description, I requested her to look over the loose sheets the morning before I waited on her, and enlighten me by the experience which she must have acquired in reading through the whole stock of 3 circulating libraries, in Gandersclough and the 2 next market towns. When, with a palpitating heart, I appeared before her in the evening, I found her much disposed to be complimentary. "I have not been more affected," said she, wiping the glasses of her spectacles, "by any novel, excepting the tale of Jemmy and Jenny Jessamy, which is indeed pathos itself, but your plan of omitting a formal conclusion will never do. You may be as harrowing to our nerves as you will in the course of your story, but, unless you had the genius of the author of Julia de Rubind, never let the end be altogether overclouded. Let us see a glimpse of sunshine in the last chapter, it is quite essential. Nothing would be more easy for me, madam, than to comply with your injunctions, for, in truth, the parties in whom you have had the goodness to be interested, did live long and happily, and begot sons and daughters." "It is unnecessary, sir," she said, with a slight nod of reprimand, "to be particular concerning their matrimonial comforts. But what is your objection to let us have, in a general way, a glimpse of their future felicity?" "Really, madam," said I, "you must be aware that every volume of a narrative turns less and less interesting as the author draws to a conclusion, just like your tea, which, though excellent hyson, is necessarily weaker and more insipid in the last cup. Now, as I think the one is by no means improved by the luscious lump of half-dissolved sugar usually found at the bottom of it, so I am of opinion that a history, growing already vapid, is but dully crutched up by a detail of circumstances which every reader must have anticipated, even though the author exhaust on them every flowery epithet in the language. This will not do, Mr. Paddy son, continued the lady. You have, as I may say, basted up your first story very hastily and clumsily at the conclusion, and, in my trade, I would have cuffed the youngest apprentice who had put such a horrid and bungled spot of work out of her hand. And if you do not redeem this gross error by telling us all about the marriage of Morton and Edith, and what became of the other personages of the story, from Lady Margaret down to Goosegibby, I apprise you that you will not be held to have accomplished your task handsomely. Well, madam, I replied, my materials are so ample that I think I can satisfy your curiosity, unless it descend to very minute circumstances indeed. First, then, said she, for that is most essential, did Lady Margaret get back her fortune and her castle? She did, madam, and in the easiest way imaginable, as heir, namely, to her worthy cousin, Basil Oliphant, who died without a will, and thus, by his death, not only restored, but even augmented, the fortune of her, whom, during his life, he had pursued with the most inveterate malice. John Guddiel, reinstated in his dignity, was more important than ever, and Cuddy, with rapturous delight, entered upon the cultivation of the mains of Tilliatoodlem, and the occupation of his original cottage. But, with the shrewd caution of his character, he was never heard to boast of having fired the lucky shot which repossessed his lady and himself in their original habitations. He said to Jenny, who was his only confidante, "Old Basil Oliphant was my lady's cousin and a grand gentleman, and though he was acting again the law, as I understand, for he ne'er showed ony warrant, or required Lord Evandale to surrender, and though I mind killing him nae mair than I wad do a muircock, yet it es just as weel to keep a calm self about it." He not only did so, but ingeniously enough countenanced to report that old Guddiel had done the deed, which was worth many a gill of brandy to him from the old butler, who, far different in disposition from Cuddy, was much more inclined to exaggerate than suppress his exploits of manhood. The blind widow was provided for in the most comfortable manner, as well as the little guide to the Lynn, and But what is all this to the marriage of the principal personages? Interrupted Miss Buskbody, impatiently tapping her snuff-box. The marriage of Morton and Miss Bellenden was delayed for several months, as both went into deep mourning on account of Lord Evandale's death. They were then wedded. "I hope not without Lady Margaret's consent, sir," said my fair critic. "I love books which teach a proper deference in young persons to their parents. In a novel the young people may fall in love without their countenance, because it is essential to the necessary intricacy of the story, but they must always have the benefit of their consent at last. Even old Delville received Cecilia, though the daughter of a man of low birth." "And even so, madam," replied I, "Lady Margaret was prevailed on to countenance Morton, although the old Covenanter, his father, stuck sorely with her for some time. Edith was her only hope, and she wished to see her happy. Morton, or Melville Morton, as he was more generally called, stood so high in the reputation of the world, and was in every other respect such an eligible match, that she put her prejudice aside, and consoled herself with the recollection that marriage went by destiny, as was observed to her, she said, by His Most Sacred Majesty, Charles II of happy memory, when she showed him the portrait of her grandfather Fergus, 3rd Earl of Torwood, the handsomest man of his time, and that of Countess Jane, his second lady, who had a humpback and only one eye. This was His Majesty's observation, she said, on one remarkable morning when he deigned to take his disjune. "Nay," said Miss Buskbody, again interrupting me, "if she brought such authority to countenance her acquiescing in a misalliance, there was no more to be said. And what became of old Mrs. What's-her-name, the housekeeper?" "Mrs. Wilson, madam," answered I. "She was perhaps the happiest of the party, for once a year, and not oftener, Mr. and Mrs. Melville Morton dined in the great wainscot chamber in solemn state, the hangings being all displayed, the carpet laid down, and the huge brass candlestick set on the table, stuck round with leaves of laurel. The preparing the room for this yearly festival employed her mind for 6 months before it came about, and the putting matters to rights occupied old Alison the other 6, so that a single day of rejoicing found her business for all the year round." "And Neil Blaine," said Miss Buskbody, "lived to a good old age, drank ale and brandy with guests of all persuasions, played Whig or Jacobite tunes as best pleased his customers, and died worth as much money as married Jenny to a cocklaird. I hope, ma'am, you have no other inquiries to make, for really—" "Goosegibby, sir," said my persevering friend, "Goosegibby, whose ministry was fraught with such consequences to the personages of the narrative. Consider, my dear Miss Buskbody, I beg pardon for the familiarity, but pray consider, even the memory of the renowned Scheherazade, that empress of tale-tellers, could not preserve every circumstance. I am not quite positive as to the fate of Goosegibby, but am inclined to think him the same with one Gilbert Dudden, alias Cathgibby, who was whipped through Hamilton for stealing poultry. Miss Buskbody now placed her left foot on the fender, crossed her right leg over her knee, lay back on the chair, and looked towards the ceiling. When I observed her assume this contemplative mood, I concluded she was studying some farther cross-examination, and therefore took my hat and wished her a hasty good night, ere the demon of criticism had supplied her with any more queries. In like manner, gentle reader, returning you my thanks for the patience which has conducted you thus far, I take the liberty to withdraw myself from you for the present. Peroration. It was mine earnest wish, most courteous reader, that the tales of my landlord should have reached thine hands in one entire succession of tomes, or volumes. But as I sent some few more manuscript quires, containing the continuation of these most pleasing narratives, I was apprised, somewhat unceremoniously, by my publisher that he did not approve of novels, as he injuriously called these real histories, extending beyond 4 volumes, and if I did not agree to the first 4 being published separately, he threatened to decline the article. Oh, ignorance! As if the vernacular article of our mother English were capable of declension. Whereupon, somewhat moved by his remonstrances, and more by heavy charges for print and paper, which he stated to have been already incurred, I have resolved that these 4 volumes shall be the heralds or avant-couriers of the tales which are yet in my possession, nothing doubting that they will be eagerly devoured, and the remainder anxiously demanded, by the unanimous voice of a discerning public. I rest, esteemed reader, thine as thou shalt construe me. Jedediah Cleishbotham. Gandrcleugh, November 15, 1816. Interior of Abbotsford.